The ring was a small thing. That was what made it so dangerous. It was a gold band set with a flat oval of dark carnelian, engraved on the face with a crest she had no right to wear and no way to explain, and it lived on the middle finger of Eleanor Vane's left hand beneath her glove, pressing a quiet circle of warmth into her skin for every waking hour of every day she spent at Ashcroft Park as a lady's maid. She had worn it for 3 years. She had never once spoken of it. And she had learned, in the way that servants learn everything, that the safest secret is the one kept in plain sight, on a hand everyone looks through, and no one sees. The house had its own way of watching. Ashcroft Park was a great gray stone manor on the edge of the North Riding, and it breathed like something alive, its corridors ticking in the small hours, its servants moving through its margins with the practiced invisibility of water-finding cracks. Eleanor was good at invisibility. She had been good at it for longer than she had been a lady's maid, longer than she had worn the plain dark dress and the white cap that told the world what she was. She was 24 years old, and she had spent the last 3 of those years learning to inhabit a room without occupying it, to hear everything without letting her face betray that she had heard. It was not a talent she had sought. It was the talent the world had made necessary, shaping her to fit the space it was willing to give her, and she had accepted the shaping the way she had accepted everything else about the life she was actually living, with the kind of quiet dignity that does not announce itself because it has learned there is no one listening to receive the announcement. It was the morning of the first dinner party of the autumn season when the trouble began. The Earl of Ashcroft had been in residence for exactly 4 days, returned from London and from whatever particular variety of coal deficiency he kept there, and Eleanor had seen him twice, once at a distance, crossing the courtyard in a dark coat with his head down against the wind, and once at close enough range to notice that his jaw was set in a manner that suggested some continuous internal argument he was losing. He was 34, as she knew from the household gossip, and he had inherited both the title and a reputation for impassivity that his steward described, admiringly, as granite. She had no reason to think further about him. She thought about him anyway, in the involuntary way of someone who has noted a detail and cannot set it down. She was pressing a gown in the upper hall when the Dowager Countess arrived. Lady Ashcroft, the Dowager, came with a matched carriage and 2 trunks and an air of established authority that suggested she did not so much arrive at houses as reclaim them. She was 61 and immaculate, and the hall footman moved for her with a speed that confirmed her standing before she had said a single word. Eleanor watched from the landing above, out of sight, as the Dowager handed her gloves to a footman and surveyed the entry hall with the particular attentiveness of a general counting fortifications. She also arrived with Miss Cecily Hart, her goddaughter. Miss Hart was 20 and possessed of dark hair arranged in the current fashion, a complexion the color of new cream, and a smile that appeared to require deliberate assembly, but once assembled, was very nearly convincing. She moved through the entry hall at the Dowager's shoulder, with the quiet precision of someone who has been trained not merely to enter a room, but to be considered upon entering it. She was the correct choice, as Lady Ashcroft would make clear to anyone who paused long enough to hear it. She had the fortune, the face, the connections, and the understanding. She understood the estate. She understood the title. She would, in short, understand everything that needed to be understood. The Earl would see reason before the week was out. What the Dowager did not know, because it was not the sort of thing that was recorded anywhere, was that his grandmother had left a ring to a girl who had sat with her for 8 months when the rest of the household could not bear to, and that girl was now pressing a gown in the upper hall and listening with the particular quality of attention servants learn when the world speaks its intentions loudly and without embarrassment. Eleanor's hand moved over the iron. Beneath the glove, the carnelian was warm. She told herself it was nothing. She had been telling herself that for 3 years. The dinner was 12 at table, and Eleanor stood at the back of the gallery while Lady Hobbs, her direct mistress, sat nearest the window with the mild expression of a woman who had long since made peace with the world arranging itself without her. Eleanor fetched and carried, and was not seen, and she watched the table from its edges the way she had always watched rooms, cataloguing everything the room intended. Lord Ashcroft sat at the head. He did not speak much, but she found, against her intention, that she kept noting when he did. A brief exchange with the vicar about drainage conditions near the lower fields. A question addressed to his estate steward, Pemberton, that was not actually a question, but a correction gently delivered. His eyes moved over the table with the specificity of someone who was actually looking rather than performing attentiveness. Twice they moved over her, standing near the wall, and did not slow. She was furniture. She expected nothing else. What she had not expected was the particular quality of the evening's arrangement. The Dowager had placed Miss Hart at the Earl's right hand, a placement so deliberate it had the quality of furniture moved with intent. She watched the young woman address herself to him with the careful warmth of someone who has practiced warmth until it no longer appears practiced, and she watched him reply with the brief economy of a man who is physically present and emotionally elsewhere. He ate. He spoke when spoken to. He performed the evening without, as far as Eleanor could read him from the back of the room, inhabiting it. Once, he reached for his wine and stopped with the glass halfway to his mouth, as though he had forgotten what it was for, and set it down, and looked at the table's candles for a moment, with an expression she could not name. She looked away before he could notice her looking. Miss Hart noticed everything. Not Miss Hart herself exactly, but the particular quality of calculation in the young woman's attention when it turned toward the servants. Miss Hart smiled at the footman with a warmth that did not reach her eyes, and she noted the placements of the room the way she might note exits, and when her gaze landed on Eleanor, it paused for 1 beat longer than courtesy required, as though she had registered something she intended to return to. Eleanor moved her hands behind her back and felt, with the instinctive attention of the hunted, that she had been seen. She was not a lady's maid because she had been born to service. That was the thing the household did not know, the thing she had taken considerable care to prevent them knowing, and it was the thing the ring on her hand knew in the pressing warmth of its metal. She had been born Eleanor Vane of the Wiltshire Vanes, the second daughter of a gentleman who had invested a great deal of his fortune in an enterprise that had not survived the winter of 1811, and she had been 21 years old when the estate and its contents had been sold to meet the debts, and her mother had gone to her sister in Bath, and Eleanor had gone to find work. There had been no money for a debut. There had been no season. There had been only a series of shrinking choices, and she had made the best of them with the dignity she had inherited from a father who had faced his own ruin without complaint. The ring had come 2 years after her father's death. The old Countess of Ashcroft had been a friend of her grandmother's, and it was that ancient connection, no longer of use to anyone, that had brought Eleanor to the house as a companion in the last months of the Countess's life. She had sat with the old woman through long afternoons, reading aloud, keeping the silences, and the old Countess had looked at her one morning with an expression Eleanor had not been able to name, and said very quietly that it was a shame the world was arranged as it was. She had pressed the ring into Eleanor's hand 2 weeks before she died. She had said only that it belonged to a girl who knew how to keep a thing without making a noise about it. Eleanor had worn it ever since. Through her subsequent employment as a lady's maid, through 3 households and 3 varieties of exhaustion, because it was the only thing anyone had ever given her that did not come with a cost. She had kept it beneath her glove. She had told no one. Until the morning of the 2nd day, when the dowager's goddaughter noticed. If you have known the particular weight of a secret carried in a household where secrets travel faster than any carriage, you will know what Eleanor was carrying that morning. Stay a little longer. It was Lady Hobbs's dressing table, and Eleanor was arranging pins when Miss Hart appeared in the doorway on a pretext that dissolved almost immediately into something more direct. Lady Hobbs was in the adjoining room. Miss Hart was wearing the smile that required assembly. "You dropped a glove," she said. Eleanor had not dropped a glove. She looked at the floor where Miss Hart was indicating, all the same, and in looking down, her left hand turned slightly outward, and the ring, which she had not yet covered, caught the morning light from the window. Miss Hart's eyes went to it, with the speed of someone who had been watching for precisely that. She said nothing more. She smiled with increased warmth, retrieved the glove Eleanor had not dropped, set it on the dressing table, and left. Eleanor stood in the quiet room and understood, with the clear-eyed economy she had developed over 3 years of careful invisibility, that she had just been seen and filed, and that Miss Hart would do something with what she had found. What she did not know yet was when, or in front of whom, or to what end. She pulled on both gloves. She went back to the pins. It was Pemberton, the steward, who told her without meaning to. He passed her in the lower corridor the following afternoon, and stopped and said, with the awkwardness of a kind man attempting discretion, that she ought to know there was talk in the servants' hall. He did not say what kind of talk. He did not need to. His face said it clearly enough for anyone who had learned to read the small, honest registers of people who cannot afford to be dishonest directly. The label arrived to her through the usual channels. Lady Ashcroft, at the card table the previous evening, had described her to Lord Kelwick's wife as a displaced creature with ideas above her station. 3 words. Displaced creature. Station. The dowager had a gift for summation. Eleanor heard it paraphrased twice more in the next 24 hours, once in the still room, and once from the under-housemaid who repeated it without understanding that she was repeating something that had been aimed. Eleanor thanked Pemberton and walked to the end of the corridor and stood at the window there, looking at the gray autumn grounds, and thought about it with the steadiness she had cultivated for exactly this kind of moment. Miss Hart had said something to someone, that someone had said something to someone else. In houses like this one, secrets moved as efficiently as water, and she had known for 3 years that hers was only as safe as the next person who looked too carefully at a gloved hand. What she had not accounted for was the Earl. She was in the library at 7 in the morning, which was the safest hour, the hour when the house was still in its preliminary arrangements, and the rooms belonged to the people who actually used them, rather than the people who occupied them. She had come for a volume of botanical drawings Lady Hobbs had requested, and was reaching for the upper shelf when she heard the door and turned. Lord Ashcroft stopped just inside the threshold. He was not in full dress. He had clearly been riding. There was mud on his boots and his cravat was loose, and he held his coat over one arm in a manner that suggested he had been inside the house long enough to remove it, and then stopped on his way to some further destination. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued as his default, a composed attentiveness that gave away nothing, the face of a man who had learned that revelation is a form of debt. "I beg your pardon," she said, which was what servants said. He did not move from the doorway. "The volume you are reaching for," he said, "is a natural history text. The botanical drawings Lady Hobbs requested are 3 shelves down, second from the left." She looked at the shelf, then at him. He was right on both counts. "Thank you, my lord," she said, and moved to the correct shelf. He did not leave. She could feel him not leaving the way you feel a change in the temperature of a room, a pressure shift that registers in the skin before it registers anywhere else. She retrieved the correct volume and turned to go, and he said, very quietly and without apparent deliberation, "My grandmother spoke of a Miss Vane." Eleanor stopped. She did not turn. She stood with the botanical volume in her hands and looked at the middle distance of the bookshelves and felt the ring against her palm beneath the glove and felt the 3 years of careful ordinary silence pressing on one side of her and the rest of it pressing on the other. "Your grandmother was very kind to me," she said, which was true and not enough, and also all she was prepared to say. She heard him cross to the window. She heard the window glass and the distant sounds of the grounds beyond it. And then she heard him say, still without looking at her, "She gave you something before she died." It was not a question. "She gave me a great deal," Eleanor said. "Her patience, her stories, her time at the end." "The ring," he said. Eleanor turned then, because there was nothing else to be done for it. He was looking at her, not at her hands, but at her face, with the same specific attentiveness she had noted at the dinner table, the quality of looking that was actually seeing rather than its performance. She had the brief, disorienting sensation of being visible in a room she had trained herself not to exist in. The morning light made his face open in a way that his face was not ordinarily open, and she looked back at him and was aware, with the uncomfortable precision of the body, that she was standing too close to the window and too near to him, and that her heartbeat was conducting itself without her instruction. "It was hers to give," she said. "I have not claimed anything by keeping it." "I know that," he said. "I am not accusing you of anything, Miss Vane." The name arrived differently than she had expected. He said it as though he had been deciding how to say it and had settled on care. The dark moment came before she was ready for it, as dark moments tend to. It was the evening before the proposed shooting party, 3 days after the library, and Eleanor was carrying a tray through the upper corridor when she heard the drawing-room voices carrying further than they should have, the way voices do in houses where the plasterwork is old and the acoustics have never been properly understood. Lady Ashcroft's voice was the one she heard first, because it was the kind of voice designed to be heard without appearing to raise itself. "The woman is a displaced gentlewoman playing at service," the dowager was saying. "Whatever my mother-in-law may have intended, sentiment is not a policy. She has been passing herself off as common staff while wearing a ring that belongs to this house. She has been serving Lady Hobbs with complete competence," said a voice Eleanor recognized as Pemberton's, careful and measured, "and she has made no claim of any kind." "Her claim is the ring," the dowager said. "Every servant in the hall has seen it by now. A gentlewoman wearing a countess's ring in a lady's maid's uniform is a statement, whether she intends it as one or not. She has made the entire household party complicit in a confusion that reflects on Ashcroft's judgment. Cecily is to be mistress of this house. These sorts of complications cannot persist." There was a pause that Eleanor heard the way you hear the moment before weather turns. Then the dowager spoke to someone she could not identify. "She will need to be let go before the week is out. A displaced creature with ideas above her station and the good sense to be quiet about them is still a displaced creature. She ought to have known better." Eleanor stood in the corridor with the tray and breathed, very carefully and quietly, through the full weight of it. She had known better. She had known better for 3 years. She had worn the ring because it had been given to her, and because the old countess had looked at her and seen something worth marking, and she had not claimed a thing with it, not a room, not a title, not an hour's more comfort than she had earned by the work she actually did. She had simply kept it, the way she had kept everything else in her life that no one else had wanted to keep, with care and without noise. And now it was going to cost her the position, the small, careful life she had built around it. She thought, briefly, about going back to the kitchen passage and setting down the tray and deciding that none of this was hers to resolve. She had done that before, in other houses, with other things that had turned against her. She had made herself small and waited for the weather to pass. She thought about the old countess pressing the ring into her hand and saying, with the particular clarity of someone who has earned the right to speak plainly, that it belonged to a girl who knew how to keep a thing without making a noise about it. She went on down the corridor. She did her work. She told herself she was not waiting for anything. He came to find her at 9:30 the following morning. She was in the still room, which was where she went when she needed the particular quality of quiet that rooms with a single purpose provide, cataloging dried herbs for Lady Hobbs with the methodical attention that had always been her best defense against despair. She heard his step before she heard the door, because she had been hearing his step in corridors for 3 days now, with an attentiveness she was not ready to examine. He closed the door behind him and stood on the other side of the workbench. "You heard the drawing room last night," he said. She did not ask how he knew. "I was in the corridor," she said. "The acoustics of this house are irregular. I'm aware of that." He looked at her across the bench and the dried lavender and the small precise rows of labeled jars, and she looked back at him with the composure she had assembled over 24 years of needing it. And she thought, with the part of her mind that catalogued things, that he looked like someone who had made a decision and was checking whether it was the right one. "I owe you an explanation of several things," he said. "You owe me nothing, my lord." "My grandmother told me about you," he said. "Not in detail." "Enough. She wrote me a letter in the last weeks of her life, and she said that a particular kind of person had come to sit with her, and that she hoped the world would be paying attention by the time it was called on to be, and that she had done what she could." He paused. "I did not connect the name until recently." Eleanor looked at the lavender. It was very dry and very still on the bench between them. "She gave you the ring deliberately," he said. "She left a note of it with her personal papers, which I reviewed when I inherited. It was a gift freely made. There is no question of claim, and there is no question of confusion. Anyone who suggests otherwise is, I am afraid, mistaken." Eleanor thought about the old woman's hands, the papery warmth of them, the way she had pressed the ring against Eleanor's palm with a sureness that had not asked for commentary. She thought about 3 years of keeping it beneath a glove, and the particular quality of exhaustion that comes from carrying something that was always only yours to carry. "I cannot stay on as a lady's maid if it is going to cause the household difficulty," she said. "I have understood that since last night." "The household difficulty," he said with the careful deliberateness of a man measuring his words, "is not of your making. You have done your work, and kept your counsel, and asked nothing of this house. The difficulty is of a rather different origin." He came around the end of the bench, not toward her, precisely, toward the window, which happened to require passing near her, and which gave him a reason to stop at the point in the room where she was standing, without that stopping having any stated reason. She could feel the warmth of him in the cold air of the still room. It arrived in her chest before she had decided to register it, a quickening that had nothing to do with the dried lavender or the morning light, or anything she was prepared to name. She kept her eyes on the jars. She kept her hands very still. Her pulse was in her throat, and on her wrists and in the small of her back, and she was not going to look at him. And then she looked at him. He was already looking at her. He did not say anything for a moment. He looked at her face with an attention that she had no category for. That was not the attention of an employer or a lord or even a man performing interest, but the attention of someone who has been watching something from a careful distance for longer than they intended and has finally run out of reasons to stay at the distance. His hand rested on the edge of the workbench beside hers, 2 inches between their gloves. She was aware of those 2 inches with a specificity that made the rest of the room peripheral. "I have been trying to do something," he said to the window, "in a way that was adequate to the thing itself. I have not been successful." "What were you trying to do?" she asked. He turned from the window and looked at her directly. It was the look from the library again, the one that was actually looking, and she held it with the steadiness she had assembled all morning, and felt it cost her something anyway. "Find a way to say that I would like you to stay," he said. "Not as Lady Hobbs's maid." The still room was very quiet. The wound came in pieces, not all at once. He told her about the letter his grandmother had written, and what it had said about her specifically. And then he told her, with the kind of plainness that suggested he had decided plainness was the only register that would serve him here, about his first wife. Her name had been Margaret. She had died in the 3rd year of their marriage, of a fever that had moved quickly and without apology, and he had been in London on estate business when it happened, and had not arrived back to Ashcroft in time. That was the fact he had been carrying for 5 years, not as grief only, but as the specific torment of an absence at precisely the moment his presence might have meant something, and it had made him cold in the way that particular kind of guilt makes men cold, which is not cruelty, but the body's method of not feeling a thing it cannot afford to feel in company. He did not say all of this smoothly. He said it in the careful sentences of a man who has not said it before and is not certain how much to say. And Eleanor listened with the whole of her attention and did not offer comfort or commentary because she understood, with the instinct of someone who had done a great deal of their own carrying, that what he needed was for the thing to be heard and not improved upon. When he finished, she said, "She would have been glad you came home to her house." He looked at the still-room window for a moment. "Yes," he said, "I think she would." She thought about all the careful, ordinary logic she had arranged for herself, the logic that said she was a servant in this house and he was its lord, and the distances between those 2 positions were not distances that sentiment could simply step across. The logic was sound. She had been living inside it for 3 years, and it had served her adequately. She was aware that it was currently failing. "What you are describing," she said, with the precision of someone who has been precise for a long time as a form of survival, would require a great many things to be different than they are. "Yes," he said. "That is the problem I have been working on." His hand moved on the bench beside hers. He did not touch her. The distance between his hand and hers was 2 inches, and an entire world of what had not yet been said, and she was aware of both simultaneously, with a specificity that rendered the dried lavender and the labeled jars and the pale autumn morning behind the window entirely irrelevant. "My grandmother said you knew how to keep a thing without making a noise about it," he said. "I've been thinking that a man who has been making rather too much noise about nothing for the past few years might benefit from the company of someone who knows how to be quiet." She almost smiled. She did not. "She wrote to you about the ring," Eleanor said. "What else did she write?" "Everything necessary," he said. She was precise at the end. He reached, very deliberately and without pretense, and took her gloved hand from the workbench. He held it for a moment, turned it slightly, and looked at the ring on her finger the way she had seen him look at the estate documents, with the attention of someone taking a proper inventory. Then he let go, which was correct. She felt it for the rest of the morning, his hand having been there in the particular warmth of the place where it had rested, and she thought about adequate and what it meant, and she thought that the old countess had been right about the world needing to pay attention by the time it was called on to be. The dinner party assembled in the great hall at 6. Lady Ashcroft was at the head of the receiving line in ice blue silk, and Miss Hart stood at her right hand in ivory, and the room was warm with candles, and the early autumn necessity of a fire in the great hearth, and Eleanor stood at her post near the wall and watched the arrivals and tried to feel nothing in particular. She saw the Earl enter from the far side of the room. He crossed it in 3 strides that had a quality of intention she had learned to recognize in the past 4 days, and the Dowager's attention moved to him with the sharpness of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this approach. He stopped before his mother and Miss Hart and 2 county families whose names Eleanor had learned from the seating arrangement, and he said, in a voice that was level and quiet, and entirely audible in the precise way that rooms like this make certain voices precise, "I must correct something that has been said in this house that is not accurate. Miss Vane was my grandmother's companion in her last months. She was given a gift by her that was freely and deliberately made. She has conducted herself in this house with complete integrity. Any suggestion otherwise reflects on the person who suggested it, and on no one else." The room did the thing rooms do, which is to become briefly more still than rooms ordinarily are. Miss Hart looked at her ivory gloves. Lady Ashcroft looked at her son with the expression of a woman recalibrating. The Earl looked for a moment at Eleanor. It was brief. It was enough. She stood at the wall and thought, carefully, that this was a beginning and not an ending, and that beginnings of this kind required the same quality of patience that had got her through everything else, and that the old countess, wherever she was probably satisfied with the evening's arrangements. The adjustments required took time, as adjustments in houses of this kind always take time, because the machinery of position and expectation does not shift in a single evening, but over a succession of mornings and letters and conversations conducted at the edges of rooms. Lady Ashcroft did not soften immediately, but she was not cruel, and she was not foolish. And she had known for a longer time than she had admitted that her son did not respond well to strategy. Miss Hart withdrew with her dignity intact, having understood the field more quickly than most, which suggested she would land on her feet, which Eleanor found she genuinely hoped. The county families talked, as county families always do, and then talked about something else, because there was always something else. Eleanor remained in the house, no longer as a maid. It was not immediately clear to anyone, including herself, what she was, which was a thing the old countess might have found amusing. She occupied the library in the mornings, and she walked the grounds in the afternoons, and she sat with Pemberton and learned the estate's particulars from a man who had managed them for 20 years, and she helped Lady Hobbs with the correspondence that Lady Hobbs was secretly tired of managing alone. She existed in the house the way she had always existed in rooms, fully, and without excess noise. Lady Ashcroft passed her in the gallery on the 4th day, and inclined her head, which was not warmth, but was not war. And Eleanor returned the acknowledgment with the quiet gravity that had always been her register in difficult rooms. In the evenings he came to the library. Not always. Not in a way that was for show or for the comfort of pattern, but in the way that someone comes to a room when the room has begun to contain what they are looking for. He brought problems from the estate, and she read the documents and offered what her father had taught her about land management, which was more than most women of her generation had been taught, because her father had not distinguished between his daughters in matters of education. He listened. He disagreed occasionally, with the focused courtesy of a man who takes disagreement seriously. She held her ground when she had reason to. On an evening in the 3rd week, he read beside her in the library for 2 hours, without either of them speaking. And when the fire had burned down and she rose to leave, he stood also, and she became aware that he was looking at her with the expression she had no category for, and she looked back. And they stood in the firelight of the empty library with nothing between them but the 2 feet of carpet that propriety still required. And she thought about his hand on hers in the still room, and about the old countess saying a girl who knows how to keep a thing, and about the specific warmth that had lived in her chest for 3 weeks without a name. "Good night, my lord," she said. "Good night, Miss Vane," he said. She walked to the door and did not look back, and she felt him watching the door after she had closed it, the way you feel a gaze through wood when it has enough intention behind it. On the first Thursday of November, when the first frost had come in the night, and the grounds of Ashcroft Park were gray and still, he asked her to walk with him. They walked to the churchyard at the edge of the lower grounds, where the old countess was buried beneath a stone that said what stones in churchyards say, and he stood at the grave for a moment with the particular quality of stillness that she recognized now as his version of something interior that did not need words. She stood beside him and did not speak, because she understood what the silence was for. He said after a while, "She would be very satisfied with herself." "She would," Eleanor agreed. He turned and looked at her, and the late autumn light was the pale gold color that England keeps for November mornings, as though it knows it will not last. And she looked back at him with the composure she had assembled all her life for exactly this kind of morning. And she felt the ring against her palm with the quiet warmth it had always kept. "I would like to ask you something," he said, "and I would like to be clear that the answer is entirely your own to give, without any consideration of what this house expects, or what the county expects, or what my mother has decided she expects. What you decide is what matters." She knew what he was going to ask. She had known it the way she had known everything in her life, in the body before the mind, in the small, careful truth of it, before anyone said a word. She said, because she had always preferred honesty to performance, "You should ask the question, my lord. I am better with actual things than with possibilities." Something moved across his face that was the closest she had seen him come to genuine amusement. It was a small thing, barely a thing at all, and it mattered to her the way small things had always mattered to her, in the exact proportion of their actual weight. He asked. She said yes. They stood beside each other in the gray November churchyard with the frost still on the stones, and he reached over and took her ungloved hand, carefully and without pretense, and held it the way he had held it once before in the still room, with the attention of someone taking a proper inventory. Only this time, he did not let go. She looked at their hands and the ring on her finger, and felt the full weight of what the old countess had seen coming, and the full weight of what she had been carrying toward it for 3 years, and she let herself be still inside it, which was the only luxury she had ever wanted, and the only one she had ever been too careful to take. It was late winter before the house fully settled into what it had become, and it was on a February evening, with snow falling softly on the grounds outside the drawing-room windows, and a fire burning in the hearth that was the same fire the old countess had kept in that hearth for 40 years, that Eleanor sat at the pianoforte and played a passage she had not played since her father's house, a piece he had particularly liked, one she had not been able to finish in the years between. The keys were the same temperature they had always been. Her hands knew what they were doing. Behind her, she heard the door, and the footstep she had learned to know. And then the particular quality of his sitting in the chair nearest the fire, and listening without asking her to perform. She played it through to the end this time. When the last note had faded into the drawing-room quiet, she sat for a moment with her hands in her lap and looked at the ring on her finger, no longer beneath a glove, no longer a thing to be concealed and carried in silence. It sat in the firelight the same way it had always sat in the firelight, the flat carnelian steady, the engraved crest of the house she now had every right to call her own. She heard him, behind her, set down whatever he had been reading. She heard the fire and the snow at the window, and the house settling into its ordinary sounds around them. If her story has stayed with you this evening, leave a word in the comments. It costs nothing and means more than you might think. She had kept it for 3 years, without making a noise about it. She had not known then what she was keeping it for. She knew now.